You think you're tough. You think you've handled stress, noise, crowds, and pressure. But if you were dropped into a historical port city for just one ordinary day, not during a disaster, not during a riot, just a normal working day, you wouldn't last. Not because you're weak, but because port cities were built to consume people. From the moment you wake up, your senses would be under attack. The air would be heavy with rot, salt, smoke, and human waste. The noise would never stop. Shouting, metal, animals, waves, arguments in languages you don't understand. There would be no quiet corner, no clean space, no safe pause. Every step would carry risk. Every interaction would demand attention. Every hour would drain you faster than the last. Hunger, fatigue, fear, and pressure wouldn't arrive suddenly. They'd pile up slowly until your body and mind started failing without warning. This isn't a story about war or catastrophe. This is about an average day. So before you scroll away, ask yourself this. How long do you really think you'd survive in a city that never rests, never forgives mistakes, and never stops watching? Stay until the end, because by the time this day is over, you'll understand why most people who lived in port cities didn't feel alive. They felt endured. And if you enjoy deep, realistic history like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because the next city we enter might be even worse. Waking up in a historical port city was not an event. It was a continuation. The city did not sleep deeply enough to offer a clean beginning, and so the morning never felt fresh. Even before your eyes opened, your body would already know where it was. The smell would reach you first, not one smell, but layers. Salt from the sea, rot from old fish and refuse, smoke trapped between buildings, damp wood, sweat soaked into fabric that never fully dried. These smells did not shock the residents. They informed them. The air itself delivered a summary of the city's condition before a single sound was processed. Sound followed immediately, not a sudden noise, but a constant presence that had never fully disappeared. Waves striking hulls, ropes scraping against wood, animals shifting, distant shouting that had no clear beginning or end. Even inside a dwelling, sound traveled easily. Walls were thin. Windows were open out of necessity. Silence was not something the city produced. At best, it softened briefly before rising again. You would not wake up rested. Sleep in a port city was shallow by design. Movement, noise, heat, and shared space kept the body partially alert even at rest. Waking felt less like emerging from sleep and more like resuming awareness. Muscles were stiff. The mouth tasted stale. The body carried yesterday forward without reset. The space you woke in would offer no comfort by modern standards. It existed to contain bodies, not to soothe them. Bedding was functional. The floor was close. Air moved slowly. Personal space was minimal. You would be aware of other people immediately, breathing, shifting, rising. Privacy did not accompany consciousness. You entered the day already observed. Morning routines were efficient because inefficiency carried cost. There was no leisurely preparation, no long consideration. Movement happened because it had to. Water was limited. Washing was partial. Clothing was reused, still holding yesterday's smells and stains. What mattered was readiness, not cleanliness. Outside, the port was already active. It did not wait for the sun to rise fully. Ships had arrived during the night. Cargo needed moving. Goods needed guarding. People who lived by the port synchronized their lives with arrivals rather than clocks. Time was measured in tides, light, and opportunity. Stepping into the street meant immediate engagement. The ground was uneven. Wet patches mixed with refuse. Traffic moved in multiple forms. People, animals, carts carried loads. There was no clear separation between walkway and worksite. Everything overlapped. Every step required attention. Looking away invited collision, loss, or confrontation. The port itself dominated the senses. Ships loomed large and close, packed tightly together. Wood creaked constantly. Ropes snapped under strain. Metal scraped. Water slapped against stone. The harbor was alive, but not gently. It demanded response. Workers shouted not to communicate emotion, but to cut through noise. Volume was necessity, not aggression. Languages overlapped constantly. Accents collided. Instructions were shouted, misunderstood, repeated. Miscommunication was common and costly. Mistakes slowed work. Delays created conflict. Patience was limited because time mattered. Cargo represented value, and value attracted attention. From the moment you arrived, you would feel watched. Not by authority necessarily, but by everyone. The port rewarded awareness. People noticed who belonged and who did not. Unfamiliar movement drew eyes quickly. Confidence helped, but too much confidence invited challenge. Hesitation invited exploitation. Balance mattered. Work began immediately for most. There was no warm-up period. Bodies moved into labor while still stiff. Loads were lifted. Ropes were pulled. Goods were carried. The work was repetitive, heavy, and relentless. Injury was a constant risk, but stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant losing opportunity. The smell of the port intensified as activity increased. Fresh fish mixed with spoiled remains. Tar, pitch, and oil-coated surfaces. Smoke drifted from cooking fires and forges. The air thickened as the day progressed. Breathing required adjustment. The body learned to tolerate irritation without reacting. Hunger was present early. Meals were simple and timed around work, not appetite. Eating was functional. Food provided energy, not pleasure. There was no guarantee of later abundance, so consumption was measured carefully. Social hierarchy asserted itself quickly. Who gave orders, who followed, who waited, who moved freely. All of this became visible within minutes. You would understand your position almost immediately. The city did not hide inequality. It displayed it openly and expected compliance. Authority was present but inconsistent. Enforcement appeared when it mattered to those in power and disappeared when it did not. People learned not to rely on protection. Self-management mattered more. Knowing when to speak and when to stay silent was a survival skill. Fatigue accumulated faster than expected. The combination of noise, heat, physical strain, and constant attention drained energy early. There was no protected moment to recover. Breaks were brief and often interrupted. The body learned to operate below comfort threshold continuously. Emotion had little space to express itself. Frustration existed, but venting it openly created risk. Anger escalated quickly in crowded environments. Restraint was safer. People swallowed reactions not because they lacked feeling, but because expression carried cost. The port did not care who you were. It responded only to function. Those who adapted moved through it with less friction. Those who resisted felt pressure immediately. There was no gentle introduction period. The city tested newcomers quickly and without apology. As the morning advanced, you would realize something unsettling. This intensity was not exceptional. It was normal. No one around you appeared shocked or overwhelmed. They moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting instinctively to obstacles and pressure. What felt unbearable to you felt routine to them. This realization would be the first true shock. Not the noise, not the smell, not the labor, but the understanding that this was simply how the day began, every day, without ceremony or relief. A port city did not ease you into survival. It demanded competence immediately, and by the time you understood that, the day was already well underway. As the morning pushed deeper into the day, the port city did not stabilize. It intensified. What had felt chaotic at dawn now revealed a harsher pattern. Everything was accelerating, and mistakes were becoming more expensive. The crowd thickened, the noise sharpened, and the margin for error narrowed with every passing hour. This was the moment when newcomers began to fail, not because the work grew harder, but because endurance started to collapse. The early hours had allowed a certain flexibility. People were still warming into motion. Instructions were repeated. Space shifted loosely. By mid-morning, that flexibility disappeared. Ships that had arrived earlier now demanded unloading. New arrivals pressed for space. Merchants grew impatient. Schedules tightened. Tides waited for no one. Time itself became a pressure. The physical environment turned hostile in subtle ways. Heat reflected off stone and water, trapping warmth between hulls and buildings. Air thickened as activity increased. Smoke, dust, and salt hung together, irritating eyes and lungs. Breathing required effort. Sweat soaked clothing completely and had nowhere to evaporate. The body lost fluids faster than it could replace them. Fatigue arrived unevenly. Those accustomed to the port adjusted pace instinctively, conserving strength without slowing visibly. Outsiders spent energy inefficiently, pushing too hard early or freezing under pressure. The port punished poor pacing mercilessly. Once strength dipped below a certain threshold, recovery within the day became impossible. Noise grew more aggressive, not in volume alone, but in urgency. Shouting changed tone. Commands sharpened. Arguments broke out faster. Misunderstandings escalated quickly because repetition wasted time. The port did not reward patience. It rewarded clarity and speed. Cargo handling became more dangerous as volume increased. Loads were stacked higher. Pathways narrowed. Visibility dropped. One misstep could crush a foot, tear a muscle, or send goods crashing. Injuries happened constantly, but stopping to address them disrupted flow. Most injuries were ignored until the body forced acknowledgement. Hunger returned sharply. Early food had burned away quickly. Smells from cooking stalls intensified appetite, but eating interrupted work. Many delayed meals, pushing through discomfort because opportunity mattered more than comfort. Hunger sharpened tempers and dulled judgment simultaneously. Social pressure peaked during these hours. Authority figures appeared more frequently, inspecting, demanding, redirecting. Their presence did not bring order so much as urgency. Being noticed carried risk. Being overlooked carried different risk. People adjusted posture and behavior constantly, reading signals moment by moment. The crowd's diversity became more hazardous as density increased. Languages overlapped more tightly. Instructions were misunderstood more often. Accents blurred meaning. Gestures replaced words, sometimes incorrectly. Conflict erupted over misunderstandings that would have been trivial in calmer conditions. Theft increased as distraction peaked. Pockets were lighter by midday. Tools disappeared. Goods shifted hands without permission. Losses were discovered late and absorbed silently. Accusations rarely helped. Confrontation consumed energy and invited retaliation. Psychological strain intensified. Attention had to remain split constantly, on footing, on loads, on people nearby, on authority, on opportunity. There was no mental rest. The mind stayed alert even as the body weakened. This mismatch created errors. Hands slipped. Steps misjudged. Reactions slowed. For many, this was the breaking point. Not dramatic collapse, but subtle failure. A dropped item, a missed instruction, a delayed response. These small failures accumulated quickly. Confidence eroded. Anxiety replaced efficiency. The port sensed weakness instantly. Those who faltered found themselves pushed aside, literally and socially. Space was reclaimed by those who could still perform. There was no malice in this. It was necessity. The port did not accommodate vulnerability. It flowed around it. Heat became oppressive by midday. Shade was scarce and contested. Standing still invited jostling. Sitting invited attention. Rest required strategy and luck. Many accepted discomfort rather than risk interruption. The smell of the port reached its peak. Rot intensified under heat. Waste fermented. Human odor thickened. Breathing through the mouth dried the throat. Breathing through the nose burned. The senses dulled gradually, not from relief, but from overload. Emotion flattened. There was no space for fear or anger to express fully. Everything compressed into focus. Survival required narrowing awareness to the next task, the next step, the next moment. Thinking beyond that wasted energy. By this point in the day, you would realize something critical. There was no rescue coming. No scheduled break. No guaranteed meal. No promised rest. The city offered only continuation. You either adapted or were pushed out. And this was still only the first half of the day. The port city did not peak and decline. It surged, paused briefly, and surged again. Those who survived the morning faced the afternoon with depleted reserves and rising pressure. The worst was not over. It was simply changing form. This realization, slow, creeping, undeniable, would settle in your chest heavier than any load you carried. Not panic, not despair. Understanding. Understanding that one ordinary day here was not a challenge to overcome, but a system designed to test you continuously until you adjusted or failed. And most people, dropped into this environment without preparation, would fail long before the sun began to lower. By the time the day in a port city crossed into full daylight, the body had already spent its easiest energy. What remained was not strength, but management. The challenge was no longer how much you could do, but how carefully you could continue without breaking your rhythm. The city at this hour demanded precision rather than effort, attention rather than force. Those who misunderstood this distinction paid quietly, through exhaustion, loss of position, or simple disappearance from opportunity. Light changed everything. The glare off water and stone flattened depth and made distance harder to judge. Shapes blurred into one another. Movement looked faster than it was. The eyes worked continuously, straining to separate important signals from background motion. This constant visual labor drained focus faster than physical work ever could. Heat settled in layers. It rose from the ground, reflected from walls, and gathered between hulls. Shade existed, but it was unstable, shifting with the sun and claimed quickly by those who knew where it would appear next. Standing still became uncomfortable. Moving too much accelerated fatigue. The correct pace was narrow and learned only through experience. The crowd at midday was denser but less forgiving. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to complete, something to protect. Courtesy shortened. Gestures became sharper. Space was negotiated continuously through posture and timing. You learned when to step forward and when to wait without being told. Hesitation created friction. Overconfidence created attention. Neither was safe. Work at this hour demanded coordination. Goods moved in sequences that depended on timing rather than strength. A delay in one place rippled outward, creating pressure elsewhere. People learned to anticipate rather than react. Watching others became as important as doing your own task. Awareness replaced speed. Sound reached a steady, relentless level. Not louder than the morning, but more compressed. Calls overlapped. Instructions arrived partially. The mind learned to fill gaps automatically. This skill reduced confusion, but increased error when assumptions were wrong. Corrections cost time. Time cost opportunity. Hunger returned in waves. Not sharp enough to stop movement, but persistent enough to dull judgment. Eating required choosing the right moment. Too early, and you lost position. Too late, and your hands shook slightly when precision mattered. People learned to eat quickly, standing, without breaking attention. The city watched constantly, not in a personal way, but as a system that noticed function and dysfunction. Those who maintained rhythm were absorbed into the flow. Those who faltered drifted outward, away from central paths and into less favorable positions. This sorting happened without announcement. Money and goods circulated rapidly at midday. Exchanges happened quickly, often without written record. Trust was situational. Reputation mattered, but so did timing. People learned who to deal with when pressure peaked and who to avoid entirely. A single poor exchange could echo through the rest of the day. Mental fatigue became the dominant threat. The body could still move, but the mind began to slip. Small lapses, forgetting a step, misjudging distance, overlooking a signal, multiplied. Each lapse increased stress, which in turn increased the likelihood of another. Breaking this cycle required conscious slowing, which carried its own risks. Social tension rose as patience thinned. Disagreements were handled quickly or not at all. Lingering conflict disrupted flow. Most people chose avoidance. Yielding preserved momentum. Pride was a luxury rarely afforded at this hour. The port's smells intensified under heat. What had been tolerable in the morning became heavy by midday. The senses adapted by dulling. This adaptation reduced discomfort, but also reduced alertness. Subtle cues were missed. Judgment relied more on habit than perception. Rest was strategic and brief. A moment leaning against a surface, a pause in shade, a few slow breaths taken without stopping entirely. These micro-rests sustained function without drawing attention. Sitting fully invited interruption. Leaving entirely meant losing position. For those unfamiliar with the port, midday was when confidence collapsed. The realization arrived quietly. There was no point in the day designed to help you recover. The city assumed competence and offered none. Survival depended on adjustment, not relief. The rhythm of the port at this hour was unforgiving but stable. It rewarded those who fit into it and displaced those who did not. There was no malice in this process. It was mechanical. The port did not care who you were. It responded only to how well you moved within it. As the sun climbed, you would feel a subtle shift in your thinking. The future narrowed. Planning beyond the next hour felt unnecessary. The mind focused on continuation rather than completion. Finishing the day became the goal, not excelling within it. This narrowing was protective. It conserved energy. It reduced disappointment. It allowed people to function under sustained pressure without emotional collapse. But it also limited imagination. The day became something to endure rather than shape. By now, you would understand that lasting in a port city was not about toughness. It was about calibration. Knowing how much attention to give, how much effort to spend, and how much expectation to release. And this understanding would arrive just as the day began to lean toward its second half, when the city demanded endurance from bodies and minds already thinned by hours of constant negotiation. As the afternoon settled fully over the port city, the pace did not slow in the way a modern person might expect. Instead, it entered a phase of sustained pressure where the body was no longer asked for peak performance, but for continued function despite depletion. This distinction mattered. Strength could fail suddenly. Endurance failed quietly, through loss of focus, poor judgment, and gradual withdrawal from opportunity. The light shifted, becoming harsher in some places and blinding in others. Shadows stretched unevenly, creating visual traps. The eyes worked constantly to interpret distance and movement. This effort was invisible but exhausting. People blinked more, rubbed their faces briefly, adjusted their stance to compensate. These small movements were signs of strain, even if no one spoke of it. Heat no longer surprised the body. It pressed down steadily, trapping itself between water, stone, and wood. Sweat no longer cooled. Clothing clung heavily. The sensation was not dramatic discomfort, but constant irritation that drained patience. The body's response shifted from resistance to tolerance. You stopped hoping it would improve. The crowd changed character. Those who had arrived late in the day moved with urgency. Those who had been present since dawn moved with caution. This difference created friction. New energy collided with depleted attention. Instructions were missed. Timing slipped. Coordination suffered. At this hour, errors multiplied not because people became careless, but because mental reserves were thin. The mind began to default to habit. Habit usually worked, but when conditions changed even slightly, it failed. Corrections took longer. Reorientation cost energy that was no longer available. Hunger returned more sharply now, not as a sudden pang, but as weakness in the limbs, slight shaking in the hands, slower reaction time. Eating remained difficult. Food stalls were crowded. Stopping meant losing position or missing opportunity. Many delayed again, choosing continuation over nourishment. The port's sounds lost their variation and became a single continuous pressure. Individual voices blurred together. Meaning had to be extracted from tone rather than words. This made misunderstanding more likely. Clarification required repetition, which increased frustration. People compensated by gesturing more, relying on shared habit rather than clear communication. Social tension increased subtly, not through open argument, but through body language. Shoulders tightened. Movements became abrupt. Personal space shrank further. Minor contact that would have been ignored earlier now registered as irritation. People corrected course quickly to avoid escalation. Authority figures were less patient in the afternoon. Delays earlier in the day compressed remaining time. Expectations sharpened. Instructions shortened. Compliance was assumed rather than negotiated. Being noticed carried greater risk now than in the morning. For those unfamiliar with the port, this was the point where confidence evaporated. The realization settled that the day was not structured to help you succeed. It was structured to continue regardless of your condition. The system did not pause for adjustment. You adjusted or you were displaced. Fatigue altered perception of risk. Some became overly cautious, slowing too much and losing position. Others pushed recklessly, compensating for slowing focus with excessive movement. Both responses increased vulnerability. The correct balance was narrow and difficult to maintain under strain. The smell of the port deepened again. Heat intensified rot. Waste fermented. Human odor thickened. The senses dulled further, not out of relief, but overload. Important cues were missed. Awareness narrowed to immediate surroundings. Rest became almost impossible. Shade shifted unpredictably. Crowds filled every stable position. Leaning too long invited comment or interruption. People rested in motion, slowing pace slightly, adjusting posture, conserving effort where possible. Time perception changed. The afternoon felt longer than the morning had. Minutes stretched. The end of the day felt distant and uncertain. The mind focused on making it through the next task rather than imagining completion. For many, this was the moment of quiet failure. Not collapse, not drama, but withdrawal. They moved to less demanding positions, accepted smaller tasks, reduced visibility. Survival replaced participation. The port absorbed this without comment. Those who remained central were not stronger in absolute terms. They were better calibrated. They knew how to operate with reduced capacity. They conserved energy instinctively. They avoided unnecessary interaction. They anticipated problems rather than reacting to them. The city rewarded this adaptation. Opportunity flowed toward those who could still function smoothly. Others were pushed outward, toward the margins where work was less demanding but also less rewarding. Emotion flattened further. There was little space for frustration or hope. Everything compressed into task and continuation. The body moved. The mind focused. The rest was postponed indefinitely. As the sun began its slow descent, you would feel a shift not toward relief, but toward uncertainty. The afternoon did not promise an end. It promised a transition. The day was not finished. It was changing form again. And by this point, you would understand something fundamental. Lasting in a port city was not about surviving one intense moment. It was about surviving accumulation. Hour after hour of pressure without release. Adjustment layered on adjustment. Most people, dropped into this environment without preparation, would not fail immediately. They would fail here, quietly, when endurance replaced effort and the city demanded continued precision from a body and mind already worn thin. And the port would continue, indifferent, as it always did. As the day in a port city began to lean toward late afternoon, something subtle but decisive shifted. The work did not end. The noise did not drop. The crowd did not thin. Instead, the city entered a phase where the remaining hours demanded a different kind of endurance, one built on restraint rather than effort, on judgment rather than strength. This was the point in the day when survival depended less on what you could do and more on what you could avoid doing. The sun lowered just enough to change the light without softening it. Glare slid off the water at new angles, turning familiar paths into shifting mirrors. Shadows stretched long and uneven across stone, creating false depth and hiding hazards. The eyes had to relearn the environment a second time, and this reorientation cost energy that had already been spent. People slowed slightly, not because they chose to, but because perception demanded caution. Heat did not disappear. It lingered, trapped in materials that had absorbed it all day. Stone walls radiated warmth. Wooden hulls released it slowly. Air circulation improved only marginally. Sweat no longer cooled. It simply accumulated. Clothing stuck to skin, and every movement carried friction. The body accepted this condition without protest because protest offered no relief. The crowd changed texture. Morning urgency had given way to afternoon density. Now density mixed with fatigue. Movements became less precise. People bumped shoulders more often, then corrected quickly, unwilling to escalate. Apologies were brief or nonverbal. Everyone understood the cause. No one expected courtesy to improve conditions. Work shifted in character. The heaviest tasks had largely been attempted already. What remained were adjustments, transfers, counting, guarding, waiting, and positioning for what might come next. This work required patience and attention, both of which were in short supply. Mistakes now were more likely to be mental than physical, and their consequences spread quietly. Time felt different. The afternoon stretched. Minutes passed slowly, yet the end of the day did not feel closer. The mind stopped marking progress clearly. Instead of thinking in hours, people thought in sequences. One more exchange, one more movement, one more adjustment. Completion was postponed mentally to preserve momentum. Sound softened slightly without becoming quiet. Individual voices were less sharp, more strained. Instructions shortened further. People relied on shared understanding rather than explicit communication. This reduced effort but increased ambiguity. When ambiguity caused error, correction came quickly and without discussion. Hunger became background weakness rather than sharp demand. The body adapted by slowing reactions and conserving movement. Eating remained difficult. Those who found moments to take in food did so quickly, standing, eyes scanning, attention divided. Pleasure was absent. Nourishment was calculated. Authority presence became intermittent but heavier in tone. The day's accumulated delays compressed remaining time. Expectations hardened. Oversight increased in key areas. Being noticed carried higher cost now than earlier because there was less time to absorb disruption. Money and goods changed hands more cautiously. Trust tightened. People double-checked counts. Disputes were postponed when possible, not resolved. Resolution required energy and attention that few could spare. Avoidance preserved stability. Fatigue reshaped social behavior. People spoke less. Eye contact shortened. Bodies angled away from potential interruption. These micro-adjustments reduced demand. Those who failed to make them stood out. not as incompetent, but as unaware. The port's smell deepened again. Heat released odors trapped since morning. The air felt heavier not because it contained more, but because tolerance had thinned. Breathing became more conscious. The body adjusted posture to ease strain, leaning, shifting weight, conserving effort wherever possible. Rest, if it occurred, was brief and strategic. A moment in partial shade. A pause beside a surface without stopping completely. These moments were stolen rather than granted. Sitting fully invited interruption or scrutiny. Motionless presence attracted attention. Rest had to remain invisible. For newcomers, this phase was the most disorienting. The initial shock had passed. The early urgency had been managed. What remained was the realization that the day offered no release mechanism. There was no scheduled easing, no gradual descent into calm. The city maintained pressure until it changed form again. The mind responded by narrowing further. Long-term thought retreated. Reflection paused. Emotion flattened. The focus became immediate continuation. This was not despair. It was efficiency under constraint. The city rewarded this narrowing by allowing function to continue. Small failures accumulated now without drama. A missed cue, a delayed movement, a misjudged count. Each one was minor alone. Together, they eroded confidence. Those affected adjusted by reducing exposure, stepping slightly aside, choosing less demanding roles where possible. The port absorbed this adjustment without comment. Those who remained central were not exceptional. They were calibrated. They understood how to operate at reduced capacity. They conserved attention. They avoided unnecessary interaction. They anticipated rather than reacted. These skills were learned through repetition, not instruction. As light continued to soften, the sense of time grew uncertain. The end of the day did not announce itself. It would arrive gradually, unevenly, depending on tide, traffic, and opportunity. People prepared mentally for extension rather than conclusion. This uncertainty carried its own strain. The body could endure a known duration. Indefinite continuation was harder. People managed this by refusing to anticipate. They focused on the next movement only. Planning further wasted energy. By now, you would feel the cumulative weight of the city more than any single hardship. The noise, the heat, the crowd, the hunger, the vigilance, none of them dominated alone. Together, they created a constant pressure that reshaped thought and movement. And this was still not the end of the day. The port city did not release its hold at dusk. It transformed again, demanding a different kind of attention from bodies already worn thin. Those who lasted did so by understanding one thing clearly. Survival here was not about strength or endurance alone. It was about timing, restraint, and knowing when not to push. This understanding, once gained, did not bring relief. It brought clarity, and clarity was the only advantage the city offered. As the light continued to fade in the port city, the change was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. The day did not end so much as it lost definition. Edges softened. Distances became harder to judge. Familiar routes felt slightly altered, not enough to stop movement, but enough to demand more attention. This was the hour when the city required caution layered on top of exhaustion. The reduction in light did not reduce activity. In some areas, it increased it. Ships that had waited for favorable conditions now moved. Goods that could not be handled in the glare were shifted in dimmer light. People adjusted their pace, not slowing entirely, but moving with shorter steps and tighter awareness. The body compensated instinctively, conserving balance where visibility declined. Heat lingered stubbornly. Stone and wood released the day slowly, holding warmth well into evening. The air felt thick, not because it was stagnant, but because the body had grown less tolerant. Sweat dried unevenly now, leaving skin tight and irritated. Clothing chafed. Small discomforts multiplied into constant irritation. The crowd thinned slightly in some areas and thickened in others. Those who could leave did so. Those who had to remain concentrated near active zones. This redistribution created unpredictability. Familiar flows changed. People who relied on habit alone found themselves momentarily disoriented. Sound shifted in character again. Voices dropped in volume, but sharpened in intent. Words mattered more when fewer of them were used. Instructions were shorter, more precise. Misunderstandings now carried greater cost because correction took longer in reduced light. Fatigue reshaped posture. Shoulders slumped slightly. Steps shortened. Movements became economical. People avoided unnecessary gestures. Energy was guarded carefully because the body understood that the day was not finished yet. Hunger returned again, but now it was paired with weakness. The body asked not just for food, but for rest. Both were difficult to obtain. Those who ate did so quickly, often standing, often distracted. The act of eating felt disconnected from satisfaction. It was maintenance. Authority presence became uneven. Some figures withdrew. Others appeared suddenly, enforcing rules more strictly as conditions grew uncertain. This inconsistency increased tension. People adjusted behavior rapidly, watching signals closely. Social interaction narrowed further. Conversations became transactional only. Courtesy was minimal but functional. Everyone understood the strain. No one expected warmth. Predictability mattered more than kindness. The smell of the port deepened again. Evening released what the day had trapped. Dampness mixed with heat. Odors clung more heavily in cooler air. Breathing required effort. The body adapted by ignoring what it could. Rest was still elusive. Sitting fully remained risky. Standing too long drained energy. Leaning briefly became the compromise. These moments were taken quietly, without announcement, and ended quickly. For those unfamiliar with the port, this phase was psychologically draining. The realization settled that the day did not follow a comforting arc. There was no clear descent into calm. The city demanded continued function without signaling when release might come. Time perception fractured. The afternoon had stretched endlessly. Now minutes seemed to slip unpredictably. The end of the day felt both near and unreachable. This uncertainty weighed heavily on the mind. Small mistakes became more frequent now. Misjudged distance, delayed response, slight imbalance. None dramatic, but each one chipped away at confidence. People responded by reducing exposure, choosing safer positions, minimizing interaction. Those who remained central did so through discipline rather than strength. They limited movement. They watched carefully. They conserved attention. They accepted reduced output in exchange for continuity. As darkness deepened, the port demanded a final adjustment. Light sources appeared in patches, creating islands of visibility surrounded by shadow. Movement between these islands required planning. Eyes took longer to adapt. The body slowed further. This was the hour when many people quietly withdrew, not leaving entirely, but stepping back from demanding roles. Survival replaced productivity. The port accepted this without judgment. It had no interest in fairness, only flow. Emotion flattened almost completely now, not from numbness, but from conservation. Feeling deeply cost energy. People postponed emotion until a time that might never arrive. And still, the city continued. What made this phase so difficult was not any single demand, but the realization that the body had been operating under pressure since dawn without meaningful relief. The cumulative weight pressed inward. Endurance became fragile. By now, you would understand something clearly. Lasting here was not about bravery. It was about knowing when to stop pushing before the city forced you to. This understanding arrived quietly, without drama, and for many, it arrived too late. The port city did not mark the end of the day with ceremony. It simply shifted again, preparing to demand attention in a different form once darkness fully settled. And that shift would test a different part of you entirely. When night finally began to settle over a port city, it did not arrive as relief. It arrived as uncertainty. The heat of the day faded only slowly. The noise softened without disappearing, and the pressure that had defined every hour simply changed shape. Darkness did not calm the port. It rearranged its dangers. The first thing that changed was visibility. The city lost its edges. Shapes that had been clear in daylight became ambiguous. Distance became harder to judge. Movement required calculation again, even along familiar paths. The body, already tired from constant adjustment, had to recalibrate once more. This recalibration demanded attention that was already in short supply. Light appeared unevenly. Small sources glowed in pockets. Lamps, torches, reflected firelight, but they did not create clarity. They created contrast. Bright areas blinded briefly. Dark areas swallowed detail. Moving between them required timing and memory rather than sight alone. People learned where light would be and planned movement accordingly. Sound changed character again. The broad roar of the day narrowed into sharper signals. Footsteps echoed differently. Voices carried further. Sudden noises stood out more clearly. This heightened awareness increased tension. Every unfamiliar sound demanded evaluation. Was it routine or warning? The mind stayed alert even as the body weakened. The crowd thinned unevenly. Some people withdrew entirely, leaving the port to those whose work or necessity demanded presence. Others gathered more tightly in active zones. This concentration increased risk. Familiar faces became more important. Being recognized mattered more now than during the day. Work at night was different. Heavy labor decreased, replaced by guarding, waiting, counting, and preparation. These tasks required patience and focus rather than strength. Fatigue made this focus fragile. A moment of inattention carried greater consequence now than earlier in the day. Hunger was constant but muted. The body no longer demanded energy aggressively. It demanded rest. Food provided only partial relief. Eating late did not restore strength. It simply postponed collapse. People learned this through experience and adjusted expectations accordingly. Social behavior tightened. Conversation shortened further. Voices dropped. People avoided unnecessary interaction. Trust narrowed. Night reduced tolerance for uncertainty. Familiar patterns were safer. Deviations attracted attention. Authority presence was inconsistent. Some oversight increased to protect valuable goods. Other areas were left to manage themselves. This unevenness increased unpredictability. People learned which spaces were monitored and which were not and adjusted movement carefully. Homes near the port did not become sanctuaries at night. Thin walls allowed sound to pass freely. Smells lingered. Sleep remained light and fragmented. For those who returned indoors, the city did not release its grip entirely. It followed them through sound, heat, and anticipation. For those who remained outside, vigilance became the dominant task. Fatigue fought alertness constantly. The body wanted stillness. The mind resisted it. This tension defined night survival. Those who relaxed too fully paid quietly. Those who stayed tense too long burned out. Time perception fractured further. Night felt both shorter and more dangerous. Minutes passed quickly, but consequences arrived suddenly. Planning extended beyond the immediate moment felt risky. People focused on maintaining safety rather than progress. The psychological weight of the day pressed hardest now. Accumulated strain surfaced as irritability, withdrawal, or dullness. Emotional regulation required effort. Many chose silence to conserve energy. Children, where present, were kept close. Night was not treated as safe by default. Boundaries tightened. Movement was restricted. Familiarity mattered more than curiosity. Sleep, when attempted, was partial. The body rested lightly, ready to respond. Deep rest was rare. The nervous system remained engaged. This pattern was normal. People adapted to it over years, but it never became comfortable. What made night so difficult was not that it introduced new hardship, but that it removed visibility while leaving pressure intact. The city demanded continued navigation without offering clarity. Familiar routines became lifelines. For someone dropped into this environment, night would feel like the breaking point. The body would be exhausted. The mind would be strained. The city would offer no guidance, only consequence. And yet, for those who lived here, this was still an ordinary phase of the day. Not exceptional, not dramatic, simply another adjustment to endure. The port city did not sleep deeply enough to forgive mistakes. It asked for awareness even in darkness. It demanded restraint when energy was gone. It tested not strength, but judgment under depletion. This was the true challenge of lasting in a port city, not surviving chaos, but surviving continuation without relief. And the night had only just begun. As night deepened in the port city, the world did not quiet itself into safety. Instead, it narrowed. The range of possible actions shrank, and the cost of each decision increased. The body, already drained by the day, had fewer options available. The mind, dulled by fatigue, had less tolerance for uncertainty. This combination made the late-night hours the most dangerous not because something always went wrong, but because when something did, recovery was nearly impossible. Darkness altered distance and intent simultaneously. A person approaching could not be read easily. Footsteps echoed without clear direction. Familiar silhouettes lost their detail. The mind filled gaps with assumption, and assumption was often wrong. Every encounter demanded evaluation with limited information. This constant assessment consumed the last reserves of attention. Light sources became strategic points rather than comforts. Standing within light offered visibility, but also exposure. Standing outside, it offered concealment but reduced awareness. People moved deliberately between these zones, choosing moment by moment whether to be seen or unseen. This choice was never simple. It depended on who was nearby, what was being carried, and what time of night it was. The port's soundscape thinned further. Fewer voices meant each sound carried more weight. A dropped object, a raised voice, a sudden movement cut through the night sharply. The nervous system reacted immediately, often before the mind could interpret. This reflexive alertness kept people functional but prevented rest. Work that continued at this hour required discipline rather than energy. Guarding goods, waiting for late arrivals, maintaining position. These tasks demanded stillness and attention. Stillness was difficult. Attention was fragile. Fatigue pulled the body toward inaction, while survival demanded awareness. Hunger faded into background weakness. The body no longer asked loudly for food. It simply slowed. Movements became heavier. Reaction time stretched. People compensated by reducing speed and increasing caution. This adaptation preserved safety but limited productivity further. Social behavior tightened to its narrowest range. Conversation was minimal. Gestures were restrained. Trust was selective. People relied on familiarity more than ever. Unknown faces stood out sharply now, not because they were dangerous, but because uncertainty itself was dangerous. Authority presence, where it existed, felt heavier at night. Enforcement was more direct, less patient. Instructions were short. Compliance was expected. Negotiation was risky. People adjusted quickly to avoid drawing attention. Homes near the port did not offer complete refuge. Noise traveled. Smells lingered. Sleep remained light. Even indoors, awareness did not fully disengage. The city's rhythms continued to press inward. For those sleeping, rest was conditional and easily interrupted. For those still outside, the night tested judgment under depletion. The margin for error was smallest here. A wrong turn, a missed signal, a moment of inattention could cascade into loss that could not be repaired before morning. The city offered no buffer. Time perception distorted further. Night hours felt compressed. There was pressure to endure until a vague sense of dawn rather than a specific endpoint. People did not mark progress clearly. They simply waited for the city to change again. Fatigue reshaped emotion. Fear did not spike dramatically. It settled into a steady, low-level caution. Anger flattened into irritation. Hope narrowed into persistence. Emotional restraint was not moral discipline. It was energy management. Many people quietly withdrew during these hours, not leaving entirely, but reducing exposure. They chose less visible positions, simpler tasks, minimal interaction. Survival took priority over engagement. The port accepted this adjustment without resistance. Those who remained active did so through practiced control. They limited movement. They watched patterns. They conserved energy. They avoided unnecessary interaction. These habits did not make the night safe, but they made it survivable. The most difficult aspect of this phase was not fear itself, but the accumulation of everything that had come before. The body had been alert since dawn. The mind had been negotiating continuously. By now, both were operating on reserve. This was where most people, if dropped suddenly into this environment, would fail. Not through dramatic error, but through misjudgment born of exhaustion. The city did not punish ignorance alone. It punished depletion. As the deepest part of night settled in, the port did not offer reassurance. It offered continuity. The same risks remained. The same demands persisted. Only the light had changed. For those who lived here, this was not exceptional. It was understood. They learned to expect it and adjust. For an outsider, it would feel relentless. And this relentless continuation, hour after hour without release, is what made lasting in a port city so difficult. Not because it was constantly dangerous, but because it demanded competence when the body and mind were least able to provide it. By the time the first hint of morning approached, those who remained were not relieved. They were simply still standing. And that, in a port city, counted as success. Returning home in a port city was not a moment of relief. It was a transition from one kind of pressure to another. The street did not release you gently, and the doorway did not separate the world cleanly. The city followed you inside, clinging to your body, your senses, and your thoughts. Home was not an escape from the port. It was a continuation of it in a more compressed form. The walk back itself demanded effort. Fatigue slowed steps, but caution prevented rest. Streets looked different in low light. Familiar routes required attention again. Sounds echoed unpredictably. The body moved carefully, not trusting instinct alone. By the time you reached your dwelling, energy was already thin. Crossing the threshold did not mean silence. Walls were thin. Openings were necessary for air. The sounds of neighbors, animals, distant work, and the harbor itself bled inward. The city's rhythm softened but did not stop. Even indoors, the port remained audible. Space inside was limited. Homes were designed to hold bodies, not comfort them. Movement was constrained. Furniture was minimal. Objects served multiple purposes. There was little room to stretch, to pace, or to decompress physically. The body folded itself into the available space without ceremony. Smell lingered heavily indoors. Clothing carried the day's residue: salt, sweat, smoke, rot, and released it slowly. Washing reduced discomfort but did not reset the body. Water was limited. Cleaning was partial. The sensation of the day remained on the skin. Social presence was immediate. Rarely did anyone return to an empty space. Family members, lodgers, or neighbors shared the same room or adjacent spaces. Privacy did not arrive with the closing of a door. It had to be negotiated through silence and restraint. Conversation was minimal, not from lack of connection, but from exhaustion. There was little need to recount the day. Everyone had endured something similar. Shared understanding replaced explanation. Words were saved for necessity. Eating at home was functional. Meals were simple and repetitive. Hunger was dulled by fatigue. Eating did not restore energy fully. It prevented collapse. The act was quick, often distracted, sometimes interrupted. Pleasure was secondary to maintenance. The body began to feel the accumulated cost of the day more sharply indoors. Muscles tightened. Joints ached. Small injuries announced themselves now that movement slowed. There was no treatment beyond rest, and rest was limited. The body learned to coexist with discomfort rather than eliminate it. Preparing for sleep was not ceremonial. Bedding was arranged quickly. Space was negotiated. Positions were chosen based on habit and hierarchy. Children were placed where they could be monitored. Adults positioned themselves where movement was least disruptive. These patterns were familiar and automatic. Sleep did not arrive easily. The nervous system remained alert. Sounds triggered brief waking. Heat lingered. Bodies shifted carefully to avoid disturbing others. Rest came in fragments rather than waves. This pattern was normal, but never fully restorative. The mind did not unwind completely. Thoughts lingered on unfinished tasks, missed opportunities, minor conflicts, and immediate concerns for the next day. Anxiety was practical rather than emotional. It focused on logistics, not abstraction. Night inside the home did not erase social pressure. Roles remained visible. Expectations continued. Tension from the day carried forward quietly. Disputes were postponed rather than resolved. Silence maintained stability. For those living near the port, late-night disturbances were common. Movement outside, raised voices, or sudden noise interrupted rest. The body learned to assess quickly whether to react or ignore. Most disturbances faded. Some did not. Children adapted early to this environment. Sleep was light. Noise was normal. Shared space was expected. Fear was managed through familiarity rather than isolation. Independence developed cautiously. Illness complicated night significantly. A coughing body affected everyone nearby. Heat intensified discomfort. Care was communal but limited. Recovery was uncertain. Night magnified vulnerability. What made home particularly draining was the absence of contrast. There was no sharp difference between public strain and private ease. Pressure reduced slightly, but it did not disappear. The body never fully disengaged. Morning approached without announcement. People woke gradually, not refreshed, but functional enough. The day resumed rather than began. There was no sense of renewal, only continuation. This cycle shaped emotional life profoundly. People did not expect rest to heal them. They expected it to prevent collapse. Expectations were calibrated carefully to reality. This adjustment preserved endurance. What shocks modern observers is not how uncomfortable port city homes were, but how little relief they offered from the world outside. Home was not a refuge. It was a place to endure more quietly. And yet, people lived entire lives within this rhythm. They adapted. They aged. They raised children. They continued. In a port city, lasting did not depend on finding comfort. It depended on learning how to exist without it. And when you lay down at night, surrounded by the city's echo, knowing the next day would demand the same from you. That knowledge settled deeper than any physical exhaustion. That was home. As the night deepened inside the cramped living spaces of a port city, the illusion of rest dissolved completely. What little separation existed between day and night blurred further, until the hours after darkness felt less like recovery and more like endurance under reduced visibility. The body lay still, but it did not relax. The mind slowed, but it did not release its grip. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and conditional. The first barrier to rest was heat. Stone walls that had absorbed the day's warmth released it slowly, radiating inward long after the sun had disappeared. Air circulation was poor, and openings had to remain uncovered to prevent suffocation. This allowed sound, smell, and movement from outside to pass freely into the room. The body lay sweating lightly, skin irritated, muscles tense. Noise never fully stopped. The port city did not respect the boundary of night. Ships creaked. Water struck hulls rhythmically. Voices rose and fell in the distance. Somewhere nearby, someone moved, coughed, argued, or worked late. These sounds were not loud enough to shock, but persistent enough to prevent deep disengagement. The nervous system remained partially alert. Shared space made rest fragile. Bodies lay close together, often touching. Movement by one disturbed others. Turning required care. Stretching was limited. People learned to sleep within narrow physical boundaries, maintaining awareness even while resting. Comfort was sacrificed for stability. The mind remained occupied. Thoughts returned uninvited to unresolved matters from the day. Missed opportunities, minor conflicts, worries about tomorrow's work, the availability of food, the condition of tools, the health of family members. These thoughts did not spiral dramatically. They hovered quietly, preventing full release. Fatigue altered perception of time. Night felt both long and insufficient. Waking moments blurred into one another. The body drifted in and out of sleep without clear transitions. There was no sense of sinking into rest, only intervals of reduced awareness. Illness made night especially difficult. A coughing body disrupted everyone nearby. Fever intensified heat. Weakness demanded attention. Care was practical and limited. There was little to do beyond offering water, adjusting position, and waiting. Recovery was uncertain. The night magnified vulnerability. For children, this environment was normal. They adapted early to shared space, noise, and partial rest. Fear was managed through familiarity rather than isolation. Independence developed cautiously. Sleep patterns formed around interruption rather than continuity. Emotional tension from the day lingered. Disputes were postponed rather than resolved. Silence maintained balance. Confrontation required energy that no one had. The home did not erase hierarchy or pressure. It compressed them. The body attempted recovery, but achieved only partial restoration. Muscles loosened slightly. Breathing slowed. But deep repair did not occur. Pain remained. Fatigue accumulated rather than reset. This was not failure of the individual body, but a reflection of the environment. Dreams, when they came, were fragmented. The mind replayed familiar patterns. Noise intruded. Awareness resurfaced easily. The boundary between sleep and waking remained thin. As the night wore on, some disturbances faded. Others emerged. Late arrivals. Early preparations. The city never fully surrendered to darkness. It shifted continuously. Morning did not arrive with freshness. It arrived as continuation. People woke not because they felt restored, but because the cycle demanded it. The body rose stiff but functional. The mind narrowed focus again. Another day began within the residue of the last. This pattern shaped long-term health. Chronic fatigue was normal. Deep recovery was rare. The body adapted by lowering expectation. Endurance replaced vitality. Aging arrived earlier. Decline was managed rather than resisted. What shocks modern observers is not that port city residents were tired, but that they lived entire lives without experiencing full rest. Recovery was measured in preventing collapse, not restoring strength. And yet, people persisted. They learned how to function under these conditions. They adjusted pace, expectation, and ambition. They found meaning in routine, familiarity, and survival rather than comfort. Home, in a port city, was not a sanctuary where the world loosened its grip. It was a place where the world pressed closer, demanding quieter endurance. And when you lay awake in the heat, listening to the city breathe around you, knowing that dawn would demand the same again. That understanding settled deeply into the body. That was rest. And that was why most people, dropped suddenly into a port city, would not last even one ordinary day. Health in a port city was never a stable condition. It was a temporary balance that shifted constantly under pressure. People did not wake up thinking about staying healthy. They woke up thinking about staying functional. The difference mattered because the city did not reward long-term preservation. It rewarded immediate usefulness. From the moment a person began moving through the port environment, the body was exposed to continuous strain. Air thick with salt, smoke, and decay irritated lungs and eyes. Dampness clung to skin and clothing, never fully drying. Heat stressed the body for hours at a time. None of this caused sudden collapse. It caused slow degradation. Small discomforts accumulated quietly. A cough that never fully disappeared. A stiffness in the joints that lingered longer each morning. A headache that became background presence rather than a signal. People learned to ignore these signs because attention to them changed nothing. Work still had to be done. Water quality varied constantly. Some sources refreshed, others weakened. People learned through experience which water was safer, but certainty was rare. Digestive discomfort was common and expected. Recovery depended less on treatment than on time and tolerance. Food provided energy unevenly. Freshness was inconsistent. Storage was limited. Eating something questionable was often a calculated risk rather than a mistake. Hunger forced choices that health would not have allowed if alternatives existed. The body adapted by lowering expectation. Crowding accelerated wear. Close contact meant shared air, shared surfaces, shared conditions. Illness spread easily, but rarely dramatically. Most sickness moved slowly, passing from person to person as a persistent condition rather than an event. People continued working while unwell because stopping carried its own risk. There was no clear separation between being well and being sick. Many lived in a state between the two, functioning below comfort but above incapacity. This in-between condition became normal. Full health was rare enough to feel temporary. Physical labor compounded everything. Repetitive movement stressed muscles and joints. Lifting, pulling, standing, and carrying reshaped the body over time. Strength declined earlier. Endurance replaced flexibility. Pain became familiar. Rest did not reverse this process. Sleep was shallow. Recovery incomplete. The body repaired only what it could under constraint. Long-term damage accumulated silently. Mental strain followed physical decline closely. Fatigue narrowed focus. Patience shortened. Emotional resilience thinned. These changes were not labeled or discussed. They were absorbed into daily behavior. Children grew up observing this as normal. They learned early that bodies failed gradually, that energy was limited, that complaints changed little. Adaptation began young. Aging arrived earlier and more noticeably. Decline was managed rather than resisted. Older individuals adjusted roles, contributing knowledge rather than strength. Value shifted with capacity. Medical help existed unevenly and was limited in effect. Remedies focused on relief rather than repair. Access depended on means and connections. Many relied on observation, habit, and time instead. The port city did not pause for illness. It absorbed it. Sick individuals remained present, influencing others simply by proximity. This normalized sickness as a background condition rather than a crisis. Fear of decline existed, but it was practical. People adjusted behavior subtly, slowing pace, conserving energy, avoiding unnecessary risk. Prevention was limited by necessity. The most damaging aspect was not illness itself, but the absence of full recovery. The body never reset. Each day layered strain onto what remained from the last. This accumulation shaped lifespan, capacity, and expectation. What shocks modern observers is not that port cities were unhealthy, but that people lived entire lives without experiencing sustained well-being. Health was measured by function, not comfort. And yet, people adapted. They learned how to work while tired, how to think while strained, how to live within a body that was never fully restored. In a port city, the body was not protected. It was used. And learning how long it could be used without failing became one of the most important skills a person could acquire. As time passed in the port city, illness rarely announced itself clearly. It did not arrive with a single dramatic moment that forced a person to stop. Instead, it blended into daily life so gradually that many people could not say when they stopped being healthy. They only knew that certain movements became harder, certain sensations never fully disappeared, and recovery took longer than it used to. The body adjusted by lowering its expectations. What once felt like discomfort became normal. What once would have prompted rest was ignored. This was not stubbornness. It was necessity. The port did not allow space for careful recovery. Stopping meant losing position, income, or safety. Continuing meant slow damage. Most chose continuation because it preserved immediate survival. Respiratory strain was constant. Air near the harbor carried moisture, smoke, and decay. Breathing irritated the lungs daily. Coughs lingered. Throats stayed raw. People learned to breathe shallowly during exertion, conserving energy and reducing irritation. This adaptation helped in the short term but reduced resilience over time. Skin suffered continuously. Salt dried it. Dampness softened it. Small cuts healed slowly. Infections lingered quietly. Clothing rubbed irritated areas constantly. Washing helped only briefly. The body became accustomed to low-level irritation and stopped signaling it clearly. Digestive weakness was common. Food quality varied. Water sources changed. Stomach discomfort became background noise rather than warning. People learned which foods weakened them more and adjusted when possible. When not possible, they endured. Full digestion without discomfort was rare enough to feel unusual. Fatigue deepened as a chronic condition. It was not the exhaustion of a single hard day. It was the result of incomplete recovery layered repeatedly. Sleep reduced awareness but did not restore strength fully. Waking tired was normal. Waking refreshed was rare. This constant tiredness reshaped behavior. Movements became economical. Gestures were smaller. People avoided unnecessary tasks. Emotional reactions softened, not from calm, but from limited energy. Anger flared less dramatically. Joy expressed itself quietly. Pain management relied almost entirely on tolerance. There were few reliable methods to reduce it. People learned to work around pain rather than eliminate it. Tasks were modified subtly. Pace adjusted. The body compensated where it could. Illness spread easily in such conditions, but it rarely created clear boundaries between sick and well. Many lived in a state of partial illness. They functioned below their best, but above collapse. This state became normal enough that people stopped naming it. Children adapted early. They watched adults endure. They learned that weakness was not an emergency unless it stopped movement entirely. Complaints were discouraged not through cruelty, but through realism. Attention had to be saved for survival. As people aged, decline arrived earlier. Strength faded. Joints stiffened. Vision dimmed. Hearing dulled. These changes were not resisted strongly. They were accommodated. Roles shifted. Expectations narrowed. Value remained, but in different forms. Mental health suffered quietly alongside physical decline. Constant strain reduced patience and focus. Anxiety existed, but was practical rather than abstract. People worried about immediate logistics rather than distant futures. This focus preserved function but limited emotional range. The absence of full recovery reshaped identity. People understood themselves as temporarily capable rather than permanently strong. Confidence came from knowing limits rather than exceeding them. This knowledge was protective. Medical intervention, where available, offered partial relief at best. Treatments eased symptoms but rarely reversed damage. Access was uneven. Many relied on habit, observation, and time. Recovery depended more on circumstance than care. What made this environment especially damaging was not any single illness, but the inability to escape exposure. The port city did not offer clean air, quiet rest, or protected recovery. Every day added a small cost. Over years, those costs accumulated. Yet people continued. They worked, raised children, formed relationships, and lived within bodies that were never fully restored. They adjusted expectations rather than waiting for improvement. This adjustment preserved survival. What shocks modern observers is not how unhealthy port cities were, but how normal this slow decline felt to those inside it. Health was not a stable state to return to. It was a fluctuating balance that required constant management. In a port city, the body was not maintained. It was spent carefully, rationed across days and years until it could no longer continue. And most people never knew exactly when that point arrived. They only knew that one day, they could no longer keep pace with the city that had shaped them. That was the cost of lasting even a short time in a port city. Mental strain in a port city was not experienced as a sudden collapse. It did not announce itself with panic, despair, or visible breakdown. Instead, it emerged slowly, disguised as adaptation. The mind learned to narrow itself, to reduce unnecessary thought, to suppress reactions that carried cost. Over time, this narrowing stopped being a strategy and became a condition. From early in the day, the mind was forced into constant assessment. Every movement through the port required judgment. Where to step, whom to avoid, when to speak, when to stay silent. These decisions were small individually, but relentless in number. There was no moment when awareness could fully disengage. Even brief lapses carried consequence. This constant vigilance consumed attention more quickly than physical labor consumed strength. The body could repeat movements mechanically. The mind could not disengage without risk. Over hours and years, this imbalance reshaped thought patterns. People learned to think less broadly, less imaginatively, less emotionally. Not because they lacked inner life, but because inner life demanded energy they could not spare. Anxiety in the port city was practical rather than abstract. It focused on immediate logistics, timing, positioning, resources, and risk. There was little space for distant worry or reflection. Thinking too far ahead offered no advantage. The future was uncertain and uncontrollable. The present demanded everything. This focus preserved function, but it also limited psychological depth. Emotions flattened. Joy became muted. Anger shortened. Fear became background caution rather than sharp alarm. People did not feel constantly distressed. They felt constantly managed. The absence of privacy intensified this condition. There were few places where thoughts could unfold without interruption. Even at home, sound, presence, and expectation intruded. Solitude was rare and brief. Reflection had to be compressed into moments of silence rather than sustained contemplation. Social pressure reinforced restraint. Expressing frustration openly invited scrutiny. Expressing sadness invited vulnerability. Expressing ambition invited attention. All carried risk. The safest emotional posture was neutrality. Calm endurance protected survival. Over time, this emotional economy reshaped relationships. Connection existed, but it was restrained. Attachment was real, but guarded. People cared deeply without expecting stability. Loss was familiar enough to be anticipated. This anticipation softened grief, but also dulled joy. Mental fatigue altered perception of self. Identity narrowed to function. People defined themselves by what they could do reliably rather than who they were internally. Self-worth became conditional on usefulness. When usefulness declined, confidence followed. This was particularly evident during moments of failure. A missed instruction, a delayed response, a visible mistake. These moments struck deeper psychologically than physically. They threatened belonging. The fear was not punishment alone, but exclusion from flow. The port city did not humiliate loudly. It marginalized quietly. Those who struggled found themselves edged out of central spaces, given fewer opportunities, trusted less. This gradual displacement affected the mind profoundly. People adjusted by lowering expectation, reducing exposure, conserving energy. Children absorbed these dynamics early. They learned when to speak and when to remain quiet. Curiosity was shaped carefully. Emotional expression was moderated through observation rather than instruction. By adulthood, restraint felt natural. Sleep deprivation compounded everything. Shallow rest prevented full mental recovery. Thoughts replayed. Awareness resurfaced easily. The mind never fully powered down. This constant partial engagement eroded resilience over time. There were moments of release, but they were brief and controlled. Laughter appeared suddenly and disappeared quickly. Relief came in flashes rather than waves. The city allowed expression only when it did not disrupt flow. Over years, this environment produced a particular mental posture: alert, restrained, pragmatic, and quietly exhausted. It was not despair. It was endurance. What shocks modern observers is not that port city residents experienced stress, but that they lived entire lives without ever fully disengaging from it. There was no protected psychological space where the city stopped demanding attention. Yet people adapted. They learned how much of themselves to invest and how much to withhold. They learned how to continue without expecting relief. This adaptation preserved function but extracted a subtle cost. That cost was not visible in dramatic collapse. It appeared in narrowed imagination, muted emotion, and reduced capacity for rest. People survived, but they survived in a calibrated state that modern minds would find unbearable. In a port city, the greatest strain was not danger or labor. It was the continuous requirement to manage oneself under pressure without pause. And that requirement shaped the mind as surely as salt shaped the air and stone shaped the streets. As mental strain continued to accumulate in the port city, it reached a phase that was difficult to recognize even for those experiencing it. This was not panic. It was not despair. It was a gradual thinning of emotional response, a quiet erosion of inner resistance that left people functional but hollowed. The mind did not break loudly. It adjusted downward. At first, this adjustment felt useful. Carrying less reduced pain, reacting less conserved energy, avoiding emotional investment prevented disappointment. The city rewarded this posture because it produced predictable behavior. People who expected little required little reassurance. They moved through the day with fewer disruptions. Over time, however, this narrowing became permanent. What had begun as strategy hardened into condition. Curiosity faded. Strong preference softened. Emotional peaks flattened. People still felt, but within a narrower range. The mind learned to avoid extremes because extremes demanded resources the environment could not provide. Decision-making changed subtly. Choices were made more quickly, but with less depth. People selected the least risky option rather than the most meaningful one. This reduced exposure, but also reduced satisfaction. Life became a sequence of safe continuations rather than deliberate directions. Social interaction reflected this shift. Conversations became shorter and more practical. Personal stories were shared less frequently. Emotional disclosure felt unnecessary or unsafe. Relationships persisted through routine rather than expression. Familiarity replaced intimacy. This did not mean people were isolated. They were surrounded constantly. But connection lacked depth because depth required vulnerability, and vulnerability required energy. Most saved that energy for survival. The city reinforced this pattern continuously. Unpredictable behavior drew attention. Attention carried risk. Risk demanded management. Management consumed energy. The simplest solution was emotional neutrality. Over years, this neutrality reshaped identity. People defined themselves by role rather than personality. A dock worker, a carrier, a seller, a guard. These labels mattered more than internal traits. Identity anchored itself to function because function was rewarded. When function was threatened by illness, age, or mistake, the psychological impact was severe. The fear was not failure alone. It was invisibility. Being pushed to the margins meant losing the structure that held identity together. This fear drove further restraint and compliance. Sleep deprivation accelerated this process. Without deep rest, the mind struggled to regenerate emotional capacity. Thoughts replayed familiar concerns rather than exploring new ones. Creativity narrowed. Memory focused on procedure. Imagination retreated. The absence of protected mental space was crucial. There was no environment where the mind could unfold freely without consequence. Even moments of solitude carried awareness of interruption. This prevented deep reflection. The inner world remained compressed. Over time, people stopped noticing this compression. It felt normal. New generations inherited it as baseline. Children learned early that strong emotion attracted attention. They moderated themselves instinctively. Emotional regulation became automatic. This environment did not eliminate joy entirely. It transformed it. Pleasure appeared in brief, controlled moments, a shared laugh, a successful exchange, a moment of ease that passed quickly. Joy was not cultivated. It was encountered and released. Grief followed a similar pattern. Loss was acknowledged but contained. Prolonged mourning disrupted function. The city allowed grief, but not paralysis. People learned to carry loss quietly while continuing. What modern observers might call emotional numbness was, in reality, a calibrated response to constant demand. The mind learned how much of itself it could afford to expose. Everything else was conserved. Over decades, this conservation produced a population that appeared resilient but was internally fatigued. Not broken, but thinned. Capable, but limited. Enduring, but rarely restored. This psychological posture allowed the port city to function at scale. Millions of small interactions occurred daily without collapse because people restrained themselves. The cost was invisible but cumulative. The most striking aspect of this mental adaptation was how rarely it was recognized as damage. There was no language for it, no alternative to compare against. People did not mourn what they had never known. From the outside, it looks unbearable. From the inside, it felt necessary. The city demanded it. The environment shaped it. Survival depended on it. This is why most people today, dropped suddenly into a port city of the past, would not last. Not because they lack strength, but because they expect psychological release. They expect moments where the mind can disengage safely. The port city offered none. It required constant internal management without pause. It required people to live with reduced emotional range and accept that reduction as normal. And those who could not make that adjustment, those who felt too deeply, reacted too strongly, or hoped too openly, were the ones who failed first. Not dramatically, quietly. They withdrew. They were displaced. They became invisible. The port city did not crush them. It outlasted them. And that is the final, quiet truth of mental survival in a port city. Endurance was not about strength of feeling, but about learning how little feeling you could afford to carry and still continue. As years passed in a port city, survival itself quietly changed meaning. In the beginning, surviving meant learning how to move, how to work, how to endure a single day without failing. Later, it meant something far less dramatic and far more difficult to notice: learning how to fade without falling. People did not usually leave the port when they could no longer keep up. They remained inside it, gradually shifting from presence to background, from participation to observation. Aging arrived early in such cities, not because people counted years differently, but because the body accumulated strain without relief. Muscles that had once absorbed load began to resist it. Joints stiffened. Balance became less reliable. Recovery took longer. None of this happened suddenly. Each change was small enough to ignore, until ignoring it was no longer possible. What made aging in a port city especially difficult was the absence of clear transition. There was no moment when one stopped being capable and became incapable. There was only a gradual narrowing of what could be done safely. People adjusted instinctively, choosing lighter tasks, shorter movements, less visible roles. This adjustment was not announced. It was understood. The city did not push older bodies out violently. It simply flowed around them. Opportunities that once appeared naturally began to arrive less often. Trust shifted toward those who could still move quickly and respond immediately. The port rewarded speed and alertness, and aging reduced both subtly. For many, this shift felt like shrinking rather than decline. The physical world remained the same size, but the space one could occupy within it narrowed. Paths that once felt manageable now felt crowded. Tasks that once felt routine now demanded caution. Visibility became riskier. Remaining unnoticed became safer. Identity changed with this narrowing. People who had defined themselves by work, by presence, by contribution felt the loss quietly. There was no ceremony marking this change. No acknowledgement from the city. Self-worth had to be recalibrated internally, often without guidance. Some adapted by becoming observers. They watched patterns. They advised younger workers. They guarded rather than carried. They waited rather than rushed. Knowledge replaced strength. Timing replaced effort. These roles preserved a form of value, but they lacked the immediacy of earlier contribution. Others adapted by withdrawing further. They took peripheral tasks. They avoided crowded spaces. They reduced exposure. This withdrawal was not failure. It was strategy. Survival required minimizing risk when recovery was no longer reliable. The port city allowed this quiet repositioning because it needed continuity more than excellence. As long as people did not disrupt flow, their reduced presence was tolerated. The system did not punish decline. It simply stopped accommodating it. Social relationships shifted accordingly. Familiar faces remained, but interactions shortened. Deference increased. Younger individuals adjusted behavior subtly around older ones, not always out of respect, but out of recognition. The city taught its own etiquette of aging. Health decline compounded this process. Chronic pain, reduced stamina, and lingering illness limited participation further. Medical intervention offered little reversal. People learned to manage symptoms rather than expect improvement. The body became something to conserve rather than rely on. Mental adaptation followed physical change closely. Ambition narrowed. Planning shortened. The future compressed into manageable spans. People focused on maintaining stability rather than achieving change. This focus reduced frustration but also reduced expansion. What made this process particularly quiet was that it did not feel like loss at first. It felt like adjustment. Only later, when looking back was no longer useful, did some recognize how much ground had been ceded gradually. Children grew up witnessing this cycle. They saw older bodies slow, reposition, and withdraw without complaint. This taught them early that visibility was temporary, that usefulness changed, that survival depended on adaptation rather than resistance. The port city did not value legacy in a sentimental sense. It valued function in the present. Once function declined, memory faded quickly. People were remembered by those close to them, but the city itself did not pause. This impermanence shaped behavior long before old age arrived. Knowing that visibility would not last encouraged restraint. Investment in long-term recognition felt risky. People focused on immediate continuity rather than lasting mark. For some, aging brought a form of relief. Reduced expectation meant reduced pressure. The constant vigilance of youth softened slightly. There was less to prove, less to protect, less to chase. This relief was subtle and incomplete, but real. For others, aging felt like erosion. Not because life ended, but because participation thinned. The city remained loud and urgent, but they moved through it less fully. This dissonance was difficult to articulate. What shocks modern observers is not that port cities were hard on the old, but that aging happened without pause or protection. There were no spaces designed for slowing bodies, no systems to ease transition. Adaptation was individual and quiet. And yet, people lived long enough to age. They survived childhood, labor, illness, and constant strain long enough to reach this phase. That endurance itself was remarkable. The final truth of aging in a port city is not tragedy. It is invisibility. People did not disappear suddenly. They thinned. They faded. They became part of the background that allowed the city to continue. And for most, this fading was accepted without protest, because the port city had taught them from the beginning that survival was not about being seen forever, but about lasting as long as possible without breaking the flow. That was the final adaptation. As aging continued and visibility thinned further, life in the port city entered a phase that few people spoke about openly, not because it was forbidden, but because it lacked language. This was not death, and it was not survival in the way youth understood it. It was persistence without prominence, existence without demand. People were still present, but the city no longer arranged itself around them. Movement slowed again, not suddenly, but carefully. Steps shortened. Routes became predictable. Detours were avoided. The body learned which paths carried the least interruption, the least jostling, the least demand. Familiarity became protection. Novelty became risk. Time changed meaning. Days no longer divided themselves into productive and unproductive hours. Instead, they flowed in a continuous, undifferentiated stretch. Morning and evening mattered less than energy levels. People moved when they could and rested when they had to. The city tolerated this as long as it did not disrupt flow. Social presence faded quietly. Conversations happened less frequently. When they did, they were brief and practical. Stories from the past were rarely invited. The city did not reward memory. It rewarded immediate relevance. Those who spoke of earlier days did so softly, to familiar ears. Work, when it remained, became symbolic rather than central. Guarding a space, watching a path, advising rather than acting. These roles mattered, but they did not anchor identity as strongly as earlier labor had. Pride adjusted downward. Satisfaction came from continuity rather than achievement. The body at this stage functioned within tight margins. Minor discomforts required management. Fatigue arrived quickly. Recovery took longer. People learned to read their own limits precisely, because exceeding them carried lasting cost. This self-awareness was sharp, but it arrived late. Health concerns became permanent companions rather than events. Pain lingered. Breathing was shallower. Digestion weaker. Vision less reliable. These changes did not prompt crisis. They prompted adjustment. Life narrowed further, not through loss alone, but through deliberate conservation. Mental life changed alongside the body. The urgency that once defined every decision softened. There was less need to anticipate competition, less pressure to respond immediately. This reduced anxiety slightly, but it also reduced engagement. The world felt more distant, even when physically close. Emotion flattened further, but not into emptiness. Feelings remained, but they surfaced slowly and quietly. Joy appeared as recognition rather than excitement. Sadness as acceptance rather than grief. The emotional palette did not disappear. It muted. People at this stage rarely felt cheated. They had not expected permanence. The port city had never promised preservation. From the beginning, it taught impermanence through rhythm and replacement. Acceptance was not resignation. It was alignment with reality. Children and younger adults moved past them constantly. The flow of bodies did not pause. New faces replaced old ones. Skills evolved. Methods changed. The city updated itself continuously, and those who could not update alongside it became background. This background existence was not punishment. It was absorption. People became part of the environment rather than actors within it. They watched more than they participated. They observed patterns rather than shaping them. The most difficult aspect of this phase was not loss of strength, but loss of urgency. Without immediate demand, time stretched differently. Days blended. Motivation weakened. The city still existed loudly, but it no longer pulled at them with the same force. Some found peace in this. Reduced expectation brought reduced strain. There was less to prove, less to guard, less to calculate. Survival became simpler, if narrower. Others experienced quiet frustration. The world remained active, but they engaged with it less fully. This gap was difficult to name. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was distance. The port city offered no ceremony for this transition. No recognition. No acknowledgement. People crossed into this phase unnoticed. The city did not mark it because the city did not stop. Living spaces reflected this change. People stayed closer to familiar zones. They moved less far. They avoided crowded areas. Home and immediate surroundings became the primary world. Beyond that, the city blurred. Memory became more present than ambition. People recalled earlier versions of themselves without bitterness. Those memories were part of continuity, not loss. The past existed alongside the present without competing with it. This is what disappearance looked like in a port city. Not vanishing, but thinning. Not leaving, but receding. People did not fall out of the city. The city flowed past them. Modern minds often imagine historical hardship as constant crisis. The reality was quieter, more gradual. Hardship was not always dramatic. Often, it was persistent. The port city did not kill people quickly. It wore them down patiently. It allowed them to remain as long as they adapted. And adaptation eventually meant becoming less visible. This invisibility was not always painful. For some, it was protection. Attention carried risk. Remaining unnoticed preserved safety. Being overlooked reduced pressure. But invisibility also meant erasure. When people finally stopped appearing altogether, the city barely noticed. There were always others ready to fill space. This is why most people today would not last even one ordinary day in a historical port city. Not because they would collapse immediately, but because they expect life to acknowledge them, to notice them, to adapt around them. The port city did none of that. It demanded adaptation without recognition, endurance without reward, and acceptance without explanation. And those who lasted did so by understanding a final, quiet truth. In a port city, survival was not about being strong enough to stay visible. It was about being willing to fade without falling apart. That was how people endured. That was how they disappeared. Leaving a port city was rarely a clear decision. It did not resemble the clean idea of departure that modern thinking imagines, where one recognizes hardship, packs belongings, and moves on. In a historical port city, leaving was not a single act. It was a long, uncertain process that required resources, timing, and psychological readiness that most people simply did not possess at the same moment. From the outside, port cities looked like gateways. Ships came and went. Goods flowed constantly. Movement appeared easy. This illusion was powerful and misleading. The same systems that enabled trade also trapped people within narrow roles and fragile balances. To leave required breaking several of those balances at once. The first barrier was economic. Most people living in port cities operated close to necessity. Income arrived irregularly. Expenses were immediate. Savings were rare. Leaving required food, passage, and time without income. These were not abstract costs. They were immediate threats to survival. A failed departure attempt could leave someone worse off than before. Work tied people to location. Skills were often specific to the port's rhythms. Knowing how to navigate docks, tides, schedules, and social hierarchies did not translate easily elsewhere. Outside the port, those skills lost value, leaving meant becoming inexperienced again, which was dangerous in a world without safety nets. Social ties reinforced this attachment. Even restrained relationships created dependence. Shared housing, shared tools, shared information networks. All of these reduced risk within the city, but increased risk outside it. Leaving meant abandoning not just people, but systems of informal support that had taken years to build. Psychologically, the port reshaped expectation. Life there taught people to endure rather than imagine alternatives. The constant pressure narrowed thinking to immediate survival. Planning far ahead felt unrealistic. Hope was managed carefully to avoid disappointment. Leaving required imagining a future that the environment discouraged. Fear played a quiet role. Not fear of the unknown alone, but fear of losing the familiarity that made survival possible. The port was harsh, but it was known. Its dangers were predictable. Outside it lay uncertainty without guarantee of improvement. For many, known hardship felt safer than unknown risk. Timing was critical and difficult. Departure required alignment of opportunity, health, resources, and circumstance. Illness could delay plans indefinitely. Injury could end them entirely. Family obligations complicated decisions. The window to leave was narrow and often closed before it could be used. Authority also constrained movement. Travel was regulated unevenly. Passage depended on permission, payment, or connections. Ships prioritized cargo over passengers. Space was limited. Being accepted aboard was not guaranteed. Rejection could leave someone stranded in worse conditions. Emotionally, leaving demanded a level of detachment that the port discouraged. People learned to invest carefully in the present, not in imagined futures. The idea of starting over felt exhausting. The energy required to leave was often greater than the energy required to endure one more day. Over time, this dynamic created inertia. People did not choose to stay actively. They stayed because leaving never became sufficiently possible. Each day reinforced the next. Years passed not through decision, but through continuation. Even those who managed to leave often did so under pressure rather than choice. Famine, conflict, loss of role, or forced displacement pushed them out. Voluntary departure was rarer than imagined. For those who left successfully, the port remained present psychologically. Its rhythms shaped perception long after departure. Silence felt unfamiliar. Space felt unsafe. The absence of constant pressure created anxiety rather than relief. Adaptation was difficult. This psychological residue discouraged others from leaving. Stories of difficulty circulated. Success was less visible than struggle. The port reinforced its own gravity through narrative as much as necessity. What modern observers misunderstand is not that port cities were difficult to leave physically, but that they were difficult to leave mentally. The city trained people to survive within it, not beyond it. That training became a form of confinement. Leaving required not just resources, but a different way of thinking, one that the port actively eroded. Imagination, optimism, and long-term planning were luxuries rarely sustained under constant strain. This is why so many people did not flee even when conditions were harsh. Not because they lacked awareness, but because they lacked capacity. Endurance had consumed the energy required for escape. The port city did not lock its gates. It did not forbid departure. It simply made staying easier than leaving, even when staying was painful. And this is the final irony. The same city that connected distant worlds trapped countless individuals within its immediate demands. People did not fail to leave because they were weak. They failed to leave because they had been shaped too thoroughly by the environment they wished to escape. By the time leaving became imaginable, it was often no longer possible. And so they stayed. When people in a port city finally reached the point where leaving felt not just desirable, but necessary, the experience rarely unfolded cleanly. The decision itself came late, after endurance had already consumed much of their strength. By the time escape entered the imagination seriously, the body was often worn, the mind narrowed, and resources thin. This timing mattered more than people realized. Preparing to leave required secrecy and caution. Announcing intention too early carried risk. Opportunities could vanish. Support could evaporate. Information traveled quickly in port cities, and not always kindly. Many kept plans quiet, even from those close to them. which created isolation at the very moment support was most needed. Gathering resources took time. Food had to be set aside slowly, unnoticed. Small amounts of money were saved at personal cost. Tools or belongings were chosen carefully, knowing that carrying too much slowed movement, while carrying too little endangered survival. Each choice carried weight. Health was a constant variable. A minor illness could delay departure indefinitely. Weakness reduced options. Injury ended plans entirely. Many people waited for a moment when they felt well enough, not realizing that such a moment might never arrive. The city had taught them to function while unwell, but leaving required more than function. It required margin. The moment of attempted departure was often anticlimactic. There was no dramatic exit, no ceremony, just movement away from familiar routes into uncertainty. For those leaving by ship, acceptance aboard was never guaranteed. Space was limited. Priorities shifted. Being refused passage after preparation was devastating. When departure failed, the psychological cost was severe. Returning to the port city after attempting to leave carried shame, even if unspoken. Others noticed absence and return. Questions were asked indirectly. Trust shifted subtly. The city did not punish failure overtly, but it remembered. This memory mattered. People who had attempted to leave and failed were often treated as less reliable. Their commitment was questioned. Their future plans scrutinized. This made subsequent attempts harder, not easier. Some people returned quietly and tried to resume old routines. Others withdrew further, avoiding attention. The port absorbed them again, but the fit was altered. The experience of almost leaving changed perception permanently. The city felt heavier, more confining. For many, the worst part was not the failure itself, but the realization it produced. Leaving had been imagined as a solution. When it failed, there was nothing left to imagine. Endurance resumed, but with diminished hope. Those who succeeded in leaving often faced different difficulties. Outside the port, familiarity vanished. Skills lost value. Silence felt threatening. Open space felt exposed. The absence of constant pressure created unease rather than relief. Adaptation was slow and painful. Stories of these struggles traveled back to the port. Success was rarely described as simple. These stories discouraged others from attempting departure. The city reinforced its gravity through narrative as much as through necessity. Over time, the idea of leaving became something people spoke about vaguely rather than planned concretely. It existed as a distant possibility rather than a goal. This shift protected the mind from repeated disappointment. The port city excelled at producing this kind of resignation. Not forced submission, but adaptive acceptance. People learned to live within narrowing options rather than fight them continually. For some, multiple failed attempts layered despair quietly. Each failure reduced future capacity. Resources depleted. Health declined. Confidence eroded. Eventually, the idea of leaving faded entirely, not because conditions improved, but because endurance consumed imagination. What modern observers often miss is that failure to leave was not a single decision. It was a process shaped by repeated constraint. People did not choose confinement. They adapted to it. The port city did not require loyalty. It required presence. As long as people remained present, it continued to use them. Leaving required surplus of energy, of hope, of health, that most never accumulated at the same time. This is why so many people who lived in port cities died there, not because they loved the city, but because it shaped them too completely to escape. Even when departure succeeded, the port left its mark. Former residents carried its rhythms internally. They remained alert in quiet places. They struggled with rest. They measured time differently. The city followed them. Leaving did not undo the years spent adapting. It only changed the environment in which those adaptations expressed themselves. And for those who never left, the port remained both prison and provider, enemy and structure. It demanded everything and gave little, but it was the only system they knew how to survive within. This is the final truth of escape from a port city. Leaving was not prevented by walls or guards. It was prevented by exhaustion, by adaptation, and by the quiet erosion of the capacity to imagine life differently. Most people did not fail to leave because they were afraid. They failed to leave because they were already spent. And so they stayed, not by choice, by continuation. If you were dropped into a historical port city for a single ordinary day, the failure would not come where you expected. It would not arrive in the morning, when the shock is fresh and adrenaline still sharp. It would not arrive in the first hours of labor, when effort feels purposeful and limits have not yet been tested. The true failure would arrive quietly, later, when the day refuses to resolve itself and your body realizes that nothing is coming to help it recover. The idea of one day is misleading. Modern thinking treats a day as a unit with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Effort is expended with the expectation of closure. Rest follows work. Silence follows noise. In a port city, the day did not function this way. It did not complete itself. It simply transformed, carrying every demand forward without releasing any of them. From the moment you wake, the city begins taking small pieces from you. Attention first, then energy, then patience. None of these losses are dramatic. Each feels manageable on its own. This is why the danger is invisible. You continue because nothing feels catastrophic. You adapt because adaptation seems to work. By midday, you are already spending more than you are replenishing. Hunger dulls thought. Heat slows reaction. Noise compresses focus. The body compensates automatically, drawing on reserves you do not consciously track. The mind narrows to immediate tasks, abandoning anything unnecessary. This narrowing feels efficient. It feels like control. In the afternoon, the cost of this efficiency becomes apparent. Small mistakes begin to appear. Judgment slows. Recovery takes longer. The body asks for rest that cannot be granted. The mind begins to manage fatigue rather than eliminate it. Still, nothing breaks. You continue. As evening arrives, you realize something unsettling. The city is not preparing to stop. There is no signal of closure, no collective slowing that promises relief. Instead, the environment shifts again, demanding a different kind of awareness from a body already worn thin. Light fades, but pressure remains. This is where modern endurance fails, not because of weakness, but because expectation collapses. You have been enduring with the assumption that the day will end in a way that allows recovery. When that assumption fails, the psychological cost is immediate and severe. Night does not bring rest. It brings uncertainty. Visibility drops. Familiar routes become ambiguous. Sounds sharpen. The nervous system, already strained, remains engaged. Sleep, if attempted, is shallow and fragmented. The body lies down without disengaging. The mind never fully releases. By the time you reach something resembling morning again, you have not experienced a reset. You have experienced continuation. The fatigue you carry is not from one hard day. It is from a day that never resolved itself. This is why one day was enough to break most people. Not because the tasks were impossible, not because the environment was constantly extreme, but because the system removed recovery while preserving demand. A port city was not an environment designed to be survived briefly. It was designed to be adapted to slowly. Those who lived there did not conquer the day. They learned how to be consumed by it gradually, without collapsing. This gradual consumption is what modern bodies and minds are least prepared for. We are accustomed to boundaries between work and rest, noise and quiet, effort and recovery. The port city erased those boundaries. Everything overlapped. Everything accumulated. You would fail not through collapse, but through miscalculation. You would give too much too early. You would expect relief that never arrives. You would invest emotional energy where the environment demands restraint. You would try to push through rather than adjust downward. The people who lasted did the opposite. They learned to give less, to expect less, to narrow themselves deliberately. They did not live fully by modern standards. They endured functionally by historical ones. By the end of your first ordinary day, you would understand this difference too late. Your body would still be upright. Your mind would still be working. But the internal balance that allows continuation would already be compromised. And without that balance, the port city does not forgive. This is the truth behind the claim that you would not last one day in a port city. It is not an insult. It is an observation about systems. A system that demands constant attention, constant adjustment, and constant endurance without offering recovery is not survived by strength alone. It is survived by adaptation over time. You would not have that time. You would arrive with modern expectations of rest, privacy, recovery, and closure. The port city would strip those expectations away hour by hour until nothing remained but function and fatigue. And when the day refused to end in the way you needed it to, that is when you would realize that one day was never just one day. It was the beginning of a cycle that most people only survived by becoming something different from what they had been. That is why you would not last. Not because you are weak, but because the port city would not allow you to remain who you are. By the time the second half of what you would call the day unfolded, the concept of a single day would already feel meaningless. The port city did not operate in cycles that reset. It operated in layers. Each hour stacked itself on the last, and nothing was removed. Fatigue did not replace energy. It accumulated beside it, weighing every decision, every movement, every thought. What most people misunderstand is that failure in a port city was not an event. It was a drift, a slow slide away from clarity, from precision, from confidence. You would still be standing, still responding, still moving, but something internal would have shifted, and once it shifted, it would not return to its original position. The body would begin making decisions without consulting you. Muscles would tighten preemptively. Breathing would shorten. Posture would collapse inward slightly to protect energy. These were not conscious choices. They were automatic responses to sustained demand. You would notice them only after they had already changed how you interacted with the world. Your thinking would simplify further, not into stupidity, but into utility. Questions like why would vanish, only how would remain, how to move, how to avoid interruption, how to conserve effort. Anything that did not serve immediate continuation would feel heavy, unnecessary, even irritating. This is where modern endurance fails most reliably. We expect the mind to remain expansive even when the body is tired. The port city did not allow that. It required contraction. It demanded that you become smaller internally to remain functional externally. By now, irritation would be constant. Not sharp anger, but low-level friction. Sounds would feel louder than they were. Movement around you would feel intrusive. Other people's presence would feel like demand rather than company. This irritation would not be expressed openly. It would be swallowed, compressed, and carried forward. Time would lose structure. You would stop checking where you were in the day. There would be no benefit in knowing. Progress would be measured only in survival of the next stretch. Anticipating rest would feel foolish, because the city had taught you that anticipation leads to disappointment. At some point, perhaps without realizing it, you would stop thinking of yourself as someone passing through. You would begin thinking like someone embedded. This shift would feel subtle, almost helpful. You would stop resisting the environment and start negotiating with it. That negotiation is where identity begins to erode. You would lower expectations quietly. You would accept discomfort rather than seek relief. You would choose predictability over improvement. None of this would feel like defeat. It would feel like intelligence, like learning the rules. This is how the city won. Not by overpowering you, not by overwhelming you immediately, but by teaching you to adapt in ways that cost you something you would not notice until it was gone. By the time you reached what you hoped would be the end of the day, you would not feel closure. You would feel suspension. The day would not feel finished. It would feel paused. And that pause would be fragile, easily broken by sound, movement, or obligation. Sleep would not restore you. It would mute you. You would wake without reset, carrying forward the same internal compression. The second day would not start fresh. It would start already compromised. And this is where the idea of one day collapses completely. Because the port city does not break people in a day. It breaks the assumption that a day is survivable on its own. The people who lived there did not survive by facing each day as a unit. They survived by blurring days together until endurance replaced awareness. They did not mark time by recovery. They marked it by continuation. You, arriving fresh, would try to endure fully. You would try to remain yourself. You would try to keep your inner life intact. That effort would drain you faster than any physical task. The port city did not require you to be strong. It required you to be adjustable. It rewarded those who could shrink themselves without collapsing. It discarded those who could not. By the end of your first ordinary day, you would not be broken in the way stories imagine. You would not be dramatic. You would not be defeated. You would simply be misaligned with the environment. And misalignment, in a system that never stops, is fatal over time. This is why people who lived in port cities appear resilient in history. Not because they were stronger than us, but because they were shaped slowly, over years, to fit conditions we encounter suddenly. They did not endure one day. They became people for whom days did not need to be endured individually. You would not have that luxury. You would arrive whole. The city would demand parts of you, and it would not tell you which parts it was taking. By the time you noticed, it would already be too late. That is why you would not last one day in a port city. Not because you would collapse, but because you would still be standing when the city finished changing you. And the version of you that could survive there would not be the version that arrived. When people imagine the past, they often imagine danger, spectacle, and sudden disaster. They imagine that failure comes from one dramatic moment, a mistake, an accident, a crisis. But life in a historical port city teaches a different lesson. The true danger was not what happened suddenly. It was what happened continuously. You would not fail in a port city because you were unprepared for hard work. You would fail because the city did not allow recovery. Every hour took something small from you: attention, patience, strength, emotional range, and returned nothing in equal measure. There was no reset, no clean ending to the day, only continuation. The people who lived there did not survive by being tougher than you. They survived by changing slowly, over years, into people who expected less, felt less, and needed less. They learned to shrink themselves carefully so they could keep moving. That adaptation kept them alive, but it came at a cost that is easy to miss from a distance. You, arriving whole, would still expect rest to restore you. You would expect effort to end. You would expect silence to follow noise. The port city would break those expectations first, quietly, patiently, long before it broke your body. That is why one ordinary day would be enough. Not because you are weak, not because the past was brutal every moment, but because endurance without recovery is not something a person can improvise. The port city did not defeat people with force. It outlasted them. And the ones who remained did so by becoming something different than they were when they arrived. That is the truth hidden behind the noise, the crowds, and the ships. And it is why you would not last one day in a port city.